all the right arm in all the right places. Whoa, oh, so you see, my arm is just like right underneath my ass, where it should be. You should always have your arm there, because it's comfortable. And if you're not comfortable, you're not doing things right. I'm trying to imitate Victor's style of doing videos, so I'm gonna be smiling for the whole video. So I recently watched this movie called Elena, and while I didn't really find it too fascinating, at the same time, I don't really find many movies too fascinating. So I'm gonna go over my notes about it. Oh God, my arm is not under my ass anymore. That's unfortunate. So I was thinking, it's a basic story, right? Halfway through, uh, this woman, she's a dowdy former nurse of this guy, and this guy is sort of like a rather rich guy. It's a Russian movie. I don't see him as like extremely rich, maybe like just very, very, very rich. You know, they live in this sort of, palisade thing where it's sort of, it's like that guy, Frank Lloyd Wright, his sort of stuff with like all the windows and shit, like the home that they get in the third season of Get Shorty. And you know, with movies, the weird thing is that the location, the sort of things that are, unique to uh, me, that seem new to me, that's what I find most interesting, and those usually aren't like thematic things, because, thematic things are usually sort of incremented upon. They're usually, if you have a good gimmick to your movie, or if you have an interesting location. And so this location I found interesting because I was thinking, the nature just looks weird because, you know, I imagine it's like Moscow or somewhere around there. And the bushes and the shrubbery just look kind of weird. Like they looked like over by the old town, the bridge to Maryland from Alexandria, Old Town Alexandria into Maryland. Those sort of shrubberies, but they looked more sort of like in that video game, A Plague Tale. Uh, I'll link the video down below on that game. It just looks like like an environment that I imagine, for instance, I don't know, like that I imagine, for instance, the rural part of Rome to look like as an abstraction. Shut the fuck up, bitch. You're American Kool-Aid? Yes, I'm making a video about a movie called Elena. It's a Russian movie. And so,
Oh, so you're a communist.
yeah.
Oh,
Well, you are too.
right.
A lot of European towns where it's sort of like an atom, right? Where there's, just like a wide spread of fields and then just like an atom at the center. That's how it sort of looked to me. But at the same time, it it also looks like this nature is sort of like both the insides, the human living parts, are cramped up against the nature, and the nature is cramped up against the living quarters. So it's a weird thing. I wonder what the nature is like in Russia. But hey, could you use a bathroom like not using the bathroom. How about that? Anyway, so hmm, here's Edge. Yeah, the lighting in the movie looked sort of half like Mirror's Edge and, like a 16th, like the 40-year-old version. The opening scene to that Steve Carell movie, the 40-year-old version, which, you know, I wake up and that's always my lighting, which is basically just like when you have curtains and the room is just depressing. You know the opening to the 40-year-old version? That movie?
Oh yeah, Steve Carroll.
Yeah, Steve Carroll. And
Yeah,
how
that's a beaut.
you know how it's lit? It's like when you're in a hotel with like curtains that actually work. That's the kind of lighting it is.
What's the hotel? I never heard of that. Oh shit,
Oh,
that's a gay.
well, a hotel is all that a hotel does not. Um,
I've never been in a hotel before.
oh, I wrote a note, sympathies lie, and it was like, where do your sympathies lie? But it was also like a double entendre, like, sympathies lie, like, they don't tell the truth. So that was pretty fucking deep. Um, so the woman who used to be his nurse, uh, the guy is really fit. He's one of those like in that movie by Woody Allen. You will meet a tall, dark stranger. I forget who's in that. I think that's Malcolm McDowell. I think from Clockwork Orange, but like 30 years later.
Extra, extra. Read all about it. Family Guy is transphobic.
You shouldn't. Well, I mean,
Apparently, that's the thing.
why?
I don't know.
I mean,
I,
Family Guy.
I just read news.
I feel like
I mean that sucks for them, but it's probably like a 15-year old episode.
I feel like that's sort of like calling the KKK transphobic, but like Family Guy isn't as bad as the KKK.
I'm trying to listen to my thoughts here, and maybe I should do some laundry. Yeah, laundry
I
is
mean,
fun.
Cleveland isn't even voiced by a white guy. I mean, a black guy.
Oh yeah, and they're still getting away with that.
But anything that show does is actually, like that the episode with the chicken. That's a fucking great episode.
Right.
That's the greatest episode of anything. Anyway, uh, so I was thinking culture is property, because the whole plot of the movie is that the woman, after the guy gets a heart attack from swimming, she gets his dick so hard that he dies. She uses Viagra to kill him because she's having a sort of spickle spackle with him over inheritance, over his will, and he's sort of disagreeable because uh, she's his you know stepwife. Yeah. So he's her step husband. And what sort of impacted me about the movie was like, granted that in this sort of, Europe, uh, sort of Downton Abbey-ish, uh, which this movie isn't like Downton Abbey, I don't think. Uh, you know, you, what do they call it on Renegade Cuts? Prestigio trash. You get what I mean. Sort of the opposite of like trailer trash, but still trash. Um, where do my sympathies lie? Because on the one hand, of course, I favor more the working class angle because, I think it's ridiculous to think of it as some sort of like fall to like, you know, like give to people who you might feel are less responsible than you. I think that's sort of like the main character, her husband, the main guy, sort of reads as, you know, they get together pretty well because, especially, I guess, because the main character, the main actress, is, she reminded me kind of my aunt, really agreeable, kind of like uh, a guy's gal, but that doesn't actually exist because, people would easily find it annoying because, the inclination called being manly is sort of to be disagreeable. Um, so, given that, like, the main guy is a bit more to the side of being a bit, like, surly, you know. So, anyway, the conclusion I kind of came to is sort of that the movie, the plot relies on a sort of cyclic or modal transactionality. And what that basically means is something that changes upon observation, or that changes based on feelings, really. Like, for instance, uh, if you do something for someone, you might at first view it as a drain. Then, after a while, you might view it as a privilege. You know, there's kind of different levels of, I don't know, how would I say, uh, mm, granted that things can be taken for. So that, for instance, you can take something for granted at once, then you can actually take the lack of that for granted too. Or you can take space for granted. You could take a lot of different, you know, economic rather than just material conditions for granted. So, like, your sort of flux of things. And you can take choices for granted, like whether you're in the position to make a choice or not. And that's the whole sort of fascination with characters in a story, is that you sort of see their having to make a choice, or their, being destined, at least vis-a-vis the story, to make a choice as a sort of privilege in itself, which, you know, naturally, the way the billiard balls kind of clackety click sort of gives it a prestige or a sort of gleam to it. It makes it sort of shine in a way. But I was thinking that, you know, if you don't really look at it in a sort of fleshed out way. You can sort of view it too much as a privilege to have like a storied sort of thing. Like, oh, the stereotype of, Catholics or like Irish Catholics, I don't know, from like the Northeast is just like, ah, shit, like all these fucking kids treating like, how I got like my ass whooped. I got my ass whooped 6 days to Sunday just at the church. I was raised Irish Catholic or something, uh, in the middle of Boston. Sort of stereotype of like just not being coddled, not being like a wasp, uh, but being sort of the Irishman or something from Martin Scorsese's latest movie. And so, yeah, I think this is what a lot of modern, like Chicago school, Austrian school economics, uh, sort of falls to, because it holds a certain attitude of the subjectivity of value, which, assumes basically if the powerful, smart people aren't in charge, it's all going to go into chaos. That's the sort of attitude. It's sort of just Darwinian, but it doesn't grant, you know, sure, there's a certain concept of like comparing the value of a dollar for one person to another person. And I think that's called the velocity of the dollar. And they say that you can't compare, you know, one person's velocity of the dollar to another. And sure, but I'd say on the same route, uh, using a same sort of path to make an argument, the same sort of subjectivity of value can spring off a sort of just the if you're dumb you're smart and if you're smart you're dumb, whatever the fuck that law is called. I don't know, fucking Dunn-Loring, uh, the Dunn-Loring law of sort of values, where people who, are, precise and magnanimous and everything and just can be really shitty, actually. And people who lack scruples and, do a lot of shit and bullshit can actually really translate the sort of values to a society. I think that's where that sort of, subjectivity of value stuff goes wrong. The subjectivity of at least, like monetary value or of proprietary value. Is that what you call property? Of liquidatable shit? Because it doesn't understand that values are also, monetary, so to speak. Values are also transactional to a certain degree. So they fall to that same sort of, psychological skew. So the assumption that, like, oh, people are irrational, so, you know, we shouldn't uh, base things rationally, but we should use the people who can best sort of, take advantage in a large scale system in a sustainable way people's irrationality based on values, I think that also sort of gets stuff wrong because those values aren't always constant. You know, you have Come Town, the myth about the coconut and the banana. And the coconut, you know, he shelters in his home uh, and he collects food while the banana rapes all throughout the summer. He rapes all the little schoolgirls. But then the the coconut, the coconut, you know, he has all his food, so that's the only place that the women can go, and he has sex with the women in the winter. And the banana knocks on his door like, "Can I have some pussy to eat?" Uh, and the moral of the story, of course, is that the banana is a better person than a coconut, which is true. That's true. That's true that the banana is a better person than a coconut. And that will always, you know, trump the sort of plans of people to sort of, you know, sort people to their own sort of moralities is more sort of, I don't know, testy realities. I mean, moralities. Reality, morality, reality, morality, reality, morality. Nightmare, nightmare, nightmare. Uh, I mean, that's just what I thought. Because I was just thinking of how do you put that in language where you want to see the politics of the film in such a way that, look, like, you like these characters and they're not just, you know, bad or just, you know, impractical. And you like this characters and they're not just like saints or some shit. They're not just like, you know, I will break no eggs to make an omelet. But you agree with one person over the other, but due to, I don't know, some sort of, you know, one of the characters you sort of still like, or, you know, that character you still don't really quite care for because they're just, like, not quite interesting enough. Uh, that's what I found interesting about the movie, besides the sort of, like, lighting and just the pacing, which I thought was, like, the pacing, it kind of reminded me of like a Yorgos Lanthimos film. I don't know if that's actually accurate. I don't really have knowledge of cinematography, so I'm just kind of putting across a feel. Like, it was sort of like slow paced, but not actually. Uh, but kind of. But given what was being argued about and the feeling throughout each part, although I don't really think I picked up on everything, even though I think I watched pretty closely. Um, there might have been like some visual stuff I just didn't quite pay attention to. I mean, just to say, it was kind of like slow paced, but, you know, just enough, basically. And just enough to sort of not work in the way it had to work, which is in such a way to sort of, you know, make it about these characters and not about like exciting characters per se. But this is the end of the video. goodbye. This is my video about transactionality and what does that really mean. Maybe, uh, you know, number one is going to be, the lowest at some time, and maybe it's going to be first place at another time. That's what it's about, basically. How in list videos, uh, you can either have lists that, what's superior, or you can have lists where, you're going from 1 to 10 to stress the numerosity. There's two different perspectives of sort of value, which basically uh, get at this sort of subject-object thing in a more direct way, uh, regarding metrics and regarding perspective, regarding like mirrors and stuff, which I think is a motif like used in the movie or something. They tend to use mirrors in movies. That kind of happens sometimes, I guess. Uh, but I just thought that sort of idea of reflection was interesting, because I think people can be a bit zero sum sometimes when they don't realize sometimes the fact is that it's not like a life, but it's like a day. It's like a day sort of being compared to itself, or imagining a day as being forever, but in a cycle, which it is, as far as we know.